Welcome to this presentation. Very pleased that you're going to be able to view this. Hopefully not taking too much time out of what I suspect is a very busy schedule. My name is Dr. James Halpern. I've been with the American Red Cross for over 20 years. During that time, I have responded to fires, floods, hurricanes, building collapses, plane crashes, terror attacks, and even school shootings. But nothing in my experience is as intense, as powerful, as horrific as what some of you are going through. So I'm very pleased to be able to be making this presentation as a Red Cross volunteer. And I would also say that some of what's going to be in the presentation comes out of some of my academic work because I've written 3 disaster mental health textbooks in the course of the last 10 years or so. So what we're going to be doing in this presentation is looking at the nature of this event, the particular stressors connected with what you all are likely to be experiencing, some expected stress reactions and trauma reactions, looking to see what makes some of you more vulnerable to developing psychological problems, some of the psychological occupational hazards. That is, there's plenty of other hazards for doing the work, but there are psychological ones as well. And we'll also be talking about some of the rewards of doing this kind of work. Um, Whether you experience psychological fatigue, compassion fatigue, or compassion satisfaction has a lot to do with how well you're taking care of yourself, how well you're taking care of one another. And that's what we're going to be focusing on at the end of the presentation, as well as some of the resources that are available to you. There are crisis hotlines that you can access, and people out there who very much want to be of help to you. This event is very big and very bad and very long. That's another way of talking about scope, intensity, and duration. COVID-19 is going to kill, impact, and last longer than any kind of disaster in American history. Unlike anything that we've ever responded to, there's not a discrete beginning and there's not a discrete end. So there's going to be some mental health impact, more than what Governor Cuomo talked about as cabin fever. Yes, there is cabin fever, and there are a lot of folks out there who are isolated and unhappy about that. But we know there's going to be more problems than that. One of the things that a lot of folks are concerned about, including I suspect many of you, is do you have this virus? Could you be giving it to someone else? Could someone else be giving it to you? There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. That's part of what makes this event so difficult. Um, Humanitarian workers for decades have been telling us what some of the pressures are, what some of the stressors are. And these are the folks who have been responding to events all over the world, some of the worst events. And what they tell us, and what may seem all too familiar to you, is that there's just not enough time, there's enormous responsibility, there's way too much work, and what you might be surprised by, but I suspect you're experiencing, is some of the problems with communication between agencies as you discover that there's not the kind of communication that you'd like between different subgroups and groups trying to help you manage this event. But we have some new research from the National Child Center of Post-Traumatic Stress. And based on survey research, these are some of the issues that are impacting healthcare workers. Things are changing rapidly, hard to stay up with the kind of information that you need to know. Again, as I look through this list, it occurs to me that you're probably quite familiar with these stressors. The healthcare system can seem overwhelmed. Many of you are taking on unfamiliar duties, having to make decisions about what resource to allocate to which patients, concern about your own protection, the protection of staff. The last three items on this list, though, relate to something that has been called, and it's a relatively new mental health concept, shared trauma reality. And what that means is that we in the helping professions are impacted by some of the same kinds of things that our patients or clients are impacted with. So patients may be worried about having the illness or disease or have it, and so might you as a healthcare worker. You're also concerned about your family becoming infected. And again, the idea that you might need to quarantine, which would separate you from your family and your colleague. These are unique stressors, again, very different from the kinds of stressors that can emerge when we are relating to other issues and other problems. And what comes up for many folks, and these are quotes from healthcare workers in talking about what they're upset about: too many patients, having to work outside my usual role, worried about my kids who might need me, worried about not being able to help my partner, my family, and feeling emotionally isolated from some very important people while I'm having to work very long hours. I want to mention one other stressor that's not, I think, given enough attention, and that is in these kind of public health emergencies, there tends to be a lot of misinformation. Rumors are very common. They seem to be spread more easily than ever before. Um, 10 years ago during H1N1, it was widely disseminated that the vaccine was more dangerous than the flu, which was, of course, nonsense. Also, nonsense that certain groups are spreading the disease. But in this age of social media, some of these rumors and misinformation can be spread very easily. And it's just important for us to be careful when we take in and pass along information that we not disseminate inaccurate information, whether it's positive or negative, um, and that we be careful about the information that we accept, that we look to trustworthy sources for that information to not make ourselves more upset than we already are. Let's turn a little bit some of the expected reactions that we're going to have when we're going through very difficult times. I think part of what this brief section is going to be able to show you is that a lot of what you're going through is what an awful lot of people are experiencing under very stressful times. So there's the physical impact of stress, and what this means is that people are going to have more physical complaints like headaches, stomach aches, and you should be aware of the fact that this probably is even more so in a public health emergency where so many folks are concerned anytime they have any kind of a discomfort that they've got COVID. And I'm not sure if that applies to you or not, but there are certainly those legitimate worries that you could have. And I say, there's no way that I would consider that psychosomatic. If you've got a physical complaint, you have a realistic concern for having an illness. But these are reactions to stress. And a lot of folks are having increased cravings, having a difficult time supplying appropriate social distance from the liquor cabinet or the refrigerator as they're gobbling up cookies and alcohol. So again, very typical kind of physical reaction. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen some of the typical emotional reactions that people have to stress. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the two on the left-hand side because I think they're so prevalent in a public health emergency. Um, you can't see this thing. This danger is frightening because it's powerful, and it is this microbial world can be frightening because it's not seen and is so threatening. also true that people can be frustrated and feel anger and irritability, which can be an expression of fear and helplessness. Things feel less controllable, and that often produces not just sadness for some or guilt for some, but also anger and rage. But often that anger can be a legitimate response to communication that is inadequate, or feeling that you're not being taken care of adequately, or resources are not being adequately distributed, fairly distributed. And that can cause a lot of anger and irritation, which can make a whole lot of sense. Again, typical reactions to these extreme circumstances. We should also note that under extreme stress, people don't think, remember, focus as well as they do under normal times. And lots of people are reporting that in addition to the distorted thinking that causes us to feel bad about ourselves, lowered self-esteem and self-blame, we're also not taking in information or giving information as well as we could. And part of what this slide reminds us is just that it's important for us to communicate as clearly as we can with our messaging, that it's okay to ask people to repeat something if we haven't heard it clearly, uh, doing self-reminders, any tricks that we can come up with that's going to allow ourselves to think a little bit more clearly, a little bit better. What this slide tells us that in addition to the sadness or crying or avoiding, what we're also going to be seeing is more conflict. And people are more likely to be engaging in a conflict because we're more cranky. And again, it's that frustration and it's that helplessness that's going to lead to more conflict. Let's try not to give ourselves permission to act out that anger, because it just makes things tougher for other folks. Being argumentative and angry outbursts usually doesn't help. But again, it is to be expected when we're under this kind of stress. And finally, as we go through the reactions, these are the spiritual reactions that occur. Um, and I think one of the things that the slide tells us is a definition of trauma. And that is that trauma can shake or shatter our basic assumptions about ourselves, other people, and the world. Some of the things that you're seeing, some of the things that you're being exposed to just should not be happening. This level of illness, this level of death, this level of stress, it just doesn't make sense. And that tends to bring about kind of a spiritual reaction as people think about a higher power, they think about God. It's certainly something that you might be dealing with. And so, in the face of this, some people are more likely to be practicing their faith, and others are less likely to be practicing, more likely to increase their faith, their belief, their practices, and others less so. But this all has to do with existential, spiritual issues as people struggle to find new meaning and everything is reassessed. This is stressful for a lot of folks, but can be expected. I want to say, though, just one other thing. For those of you who practice some sort of faith, uh, this might be an appropriate time to reach out to your spiritual care provider, to your clergy, chaplain, priest, rabbi, imam, whoever is a spiritual counselor for you because of the nature of this trauma. There's not been a whole lot of research on public health emergencies. That's in part because, fortunately, they happen only every number of years. But the one that happened in the early 2000s in Toronto, we do have some research, and you may find this familiar because what those healthcare workers, and these were mostly nurses who took part in this research, primarily what they were concerned about was that conflict between their responsibility to their colleagues and their profession, but then on the other hand, to themselves and their families. That is very much the worry, the concern, the fear that they were going to take the virus home to their families and injure them. So again, uh, this may not be news to you, but it certainly is prevalent throughout other pandemics. The other thing is this uncertainty and how information keeps changing. So these infection control procedures were not only changed daily, but they were sometimes changed hourly. And again, when people talked about what was most troublesome to them, they also said for they themselves, they were not getting enough sleep, and they were concerned that the lack of sleep was making them less effective. Interesting to note that most of these folks in Canada following the SARS outbreak did find some way to cope. It was specific to themselves, but they did say that what they were most helped by shared concern, good information, and social support. It was so helpful for these nurses and other healthcare workers to feel that they weren't alone. Sometimes that social support had to do with sharing dark humor on the nursing station that they talked about, which is true for a lot of first responders and people working so closely in these very challenging circumstances. And others talked about the importance of having conference calls where at least they could share concerns with one another. Fran Norris and her colleagues did some very important research looking at what happens to folks who are experiencing disaster and public health emergencies. And she had a sample of 60,000 survivors. And what this tells us with this very large sample, and I think a lot of you will appreciate the fact that this is a lot of folks, what we see is about 90% have a really hard time with one of these kinds of events. So whether it's your patients or yourselves, you've got about 90% of people who are saying that they're struggling. The good news, I have to say, is that the vast majority of that 90% do recover and do get better, but you've got some real impairment. So what puts you at risk for that impairment? Um, if you have severe exposure, and what that means, if you're face to face, certainly with people who are ill or sick or seriously ill or dying, or if you yourself are sick or ill, that's going to put you more at risk for psychological problems. Um, the next item tells you that if you're surrounded by a community that's in trouble, that's going to make you more at risk. And unfortunately, we all are surrounded by businesses and schools and churches that are closed or are limited. And actually, those are the examples that are used in literature that can make things that much more difficult. This idea of secondary stress, what that means is it's not just COVID-19. You might have a kid who's struggling with being out of school or a partner who's been furloughed. There may be other financial concerns that you have. All of that can add to you being more likely to have problems. It can be cumulative. Um, and then, of course, if you are sick, or in the most extreme case, if you think and believe that you might die, that puts you at serious risk. So again, these are some of the factors that the science tells us makes us more likely to have a psychological problem. All of us who are in the helping profession and care are subject to these kinds of occupational hazards. They apply to any of us who are working with people who are suffering, and they're all a little bit different. And I'm just going to unpack them a little so you have a sense of what they are and how they may or may not apply to you. You know, if we overextend our capacity for selflessness, that's when we might have compassion fatigue, when we're just so giving that we've given too much. That's compassion fatigue. Burnout is really overworking and being so exhausted physically and emotionally that it's really hard for us to function from that physical and emotional exhaustion. Vicarious trauma is taking our patient's trauma into our own hearts, into our own minds. That is, somebody's horrific story is something that haunts us that we can't put away. Um, and PTSD is when we have our own threatening experiences, when our own physical integrity is threatened, and we're having symptoms of hypervigilance and we can't sleep and we're avoiding and so forth. So you could be suffering from any or all of these to some extent as you continue to soldier on. Um, the other side of this, that is, those are the occupational hazards and compassion fatigue. But let's not forget why many of you are healthcare providers, and all of the very good reasons that you have for doing what you're doing and working as hard as you're doing. There is some real satisfaction from doing this work, feeling as though we don't have to just be watching this on TV, but we can be useful and be competent as we struggle with these unique challenges. Many folks in the healthcare profession talk about how these extreme challenges can bring about a new sense of awareness, knowledge, and even growth. And then on a social level, the kind of very special bonding and intimacy that comes as we connect with patients, colleagues, and community. Again, there's that privilege and honor that comes with being part of the healing process and the helping process and being part of a larger humanitarian effort. All of the reasons why I suspect many of you got into this profession in the first place, why you're doing what you're doing. Um, and in the next few slides, what we are going to be looking at is what's likely to make the difference between whether or not you're experiencing compassion fatigue or compassion satisfaction. Now, again, even if you're doing all the right things and not doing all the wrong things, you still are likely to be having a very hard time. But you can make a situation worse by doing the kinds of things that you've been told your whole life not to do. I want to say if you're doing any or all of these things, you got plenty of company. Um, Again, many of us are binge eating and drinking and smoking and being very cranky and so forth. But important for us to be aware of the fact that just to be a little bit more mindful, to try not to do these things since we're already having a hard time, and we ought to try to do our best not to make things that much harder. Um, then the evidence for what to do. I like the fact that we have some real science around all of this, that these are evidence informed, effective coping mechanisms. That is, to the extent that you can connect with others, that you can be transparent with others, intimate with others. There's more evidence for that than just about any other coping mechanism. I have a friend who always says when we discuss this topic, don't forget even the Lone Ranger at Tano. Um, any kind of exercise that you can do. I know for many of you, there's not a whole lot of time to do your usual exercise, but a walk around the block is a nice thing. Eating a balanced diet. Listen, I know as you look this over, you know, these are the platitudes your parents, your teachers for your whole life told you to do these things. but they're helpful in times of stress. They are effective. We need to be, again, a little bit more attentive to doing the right things and not doing the wrong things when circumstances are just so dire. The final point on this slide, though, is that what's most important is that we do and remember to do what comforts us, what soothes us, what helps us. And I can remember in responding to 9/11 that all of the first responders were looking forward to going home and watching the Yankees in the playoffs. And there were some counselors who were there who said, oh, no, you should be meditating or doing yoga. No, they should be watching baseball because that was what was enjoyable for them. Now we don't have that available to us right now, I know, but we can do puzzles and movies and taking baths and listening to music, gardening, um, spending time with people who we care about. What we have to do is just know what helps us and be sure to do that. And if it's having a cookie or two or playing a video game, awesome, do that. Whatever it is that's helpful for you, whatever it is that soothes you, remember to do that. And I have to say, that may be the most important line in this presentation, for you to take care of yourself in that way. Again, if you are somebody who is helped through prayer or meditation, yes. If it helps you to try to write down things and make sense, yes. But if it's something that's not so conventional, do that too. As long as it's not destructive or self-destructive, take care of yourself in the way that you know how. There are ways that we can sort things out in our heads that can be helpful as well. There are definitely some things that we can't control. And so you may be upset about the fact that you can't visit a relative that you care about or who's sick on the other side of the country. Or maybe there's a hospital policy that you disagree with that you're not going to be able to change. You have a colleague that talks a little more than you would like. Um, Not anything that you can do much about. So those are the kind of things that you can accept. But to think about what you can control, to try to unpack your worry so you have a sense of what you can and can't control is important. And then thinking realistically but more positively can be helpful. In other words, most of you who have gone through a whole host of challenges, including your training and your experience, know that you've gotten through rough times and know that you will get through this. So that kind of realistic, positive self-talk, you don't have to make anything up or give yourself false reassurance, but you can give yourself realistic, positive reassurance, like your training will prepare you to stay as safe as you possibly can. That even though relationships are a little bit different or a lot different, in this new virtual world that we're all in, you can find ways to stay connected to the people that you care about, and that you can find ways to control your fears, whether it's through deep breathing or exercising a little bit or taking a relaxing bath or some way in which you can try to do a little bit better with your fears. Those are certainly the ways that we can cope effectively, but everyone should know that there's help out there. There's a variety of crisis counseling hotlines that are available for folks. New York State has this COVID emotional support helpline, and these are crisis counselors who are trained in helping people specifically with COVID, and a dedicated line for healthcare workers, in part because New York State Office of Mental Health understands that you have a particular set of very difficult challenges. There's also a national disaster distress helpline that has been in existence for well over 10 years. And that help is available 24/7. These are very experienced crisis counselors, and all of these folks can give you referrals and resources if you want more additional help. Everything is free, everything is confidential, all of that is available to you. Um, if you make that call, what you're likely to find is that counselors are going to do everything they can to promote your safety, to help you to try to find some calm, to promote your sense of control, self-efficacy, to promote your connectedness, and to do whatever they can to help you be more hopeful. One of the things, though, that they are most definitely going to do is listen. They are trained listeners, and most people who are undergoing the kind of stress and trauma that you're experiencing are helped if somebody is really listening, helping them to make sense out of all of the more chaotic uh, thoughts that they have, that things don't make sense. And a crisis counselor can help people develop a more coherent sense of what they're going through. So it's something certainly that if you're struggling, you could try. But I also want to say, in addition to the crisis counseling, um, we know that there's very solid evidence for long-term treatment of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders. So if you're really having a hard time, or if when things calm down, you find you still have symptoms, make sure you look for and get good recommendations and referrals so you get that kind of help that you need, because it's out there. And again, we know that it helps folks who are going through some of these kinds of problems and having some of those kinds of disorders. Please get that help that you need if you need it. So just some final thoughts. Uh, we don't know where this thing is going. We don't know when it's going to end. We know we need to be prepared for a whole lot of uncertainty. But during that time, we know we're going to have concern for our friends and our families, and all that has to be addressed. And we're not going to be helping anybody unless we've got some plan for helping ourselves. As I said at that end of that slide, how are you going to comfort yourself? How are you going to take care of yourself? How are you going to support one another? And again, this is a time when we need to over communicate. If we've got accurate information, let's make sure that we share it. Again, important that if we're not understanding some communication, that we ask for clarification, and that if somebody asks us, that we repeat it. I love the quote from George Bernard Shaw: biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So let's be sure that we understand one another and take a little bit of time to make sure we're being clear with one another as we go through with what is going to likely to be a long-term set of challenges. And finally, I have to tell you that there are millions of Americans out there who have you in their hearts and have you in their prayers. And I know that that's sometimes important for you to be able to fully take in and recognize and know that that support is out there, because that too is often invisible in spite of the applause that you might hear and some of that, or the cards that you might get. There are millions of more folks who are giving you their love and respect, and that is coming from so many folks. The final quote from the poet Pasternak is, never under any circumstances despair, to hope and to act. These are our duties in misfortune. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation.